Hello, I'm here at the Fondation Brochet with Eric Racine, the Director of the Pragmatic Health Ethics Research Unit at the Montreal Clinical Research Institute and University of Montreal. Eric, welcome.
Thank you.
So Eric, talk to me about how you came to be doing this sort of work.
It was probably an evolution in my thinking, both personal and academic, that led me to bioethics. I think as a child I was quite interested in ecology and biology. I actually wanted to do and study environmental sciences for a very long time, and something I knew, I think, very early on in my life is that I wanted to be a researcher. I wanted to research, pollution in fishes and in rivers and so on. And at some point, in my high school trajectory, I realized that sciences were perhaps not exactly what what I had kind of expected. And at the same time, I discovered literature, which really brought me to realize how the humanities were a fantastic world of exploration of ideas and experiences. And so I was kind of had a past love and a new love to reconcile. And so basically when I started my university training, I opted for philosophy and political science. And during that training, I was kind of eager to see if there were ways to bridge the biological sciences and the humanities and social sciences. And at some point, I got interested in philosophy of mind, and in particular, the impact of neuroscience in our understanding of the mind and the brain. And that got me to pursue a master's in philosophy of mind. And also during that training, I realized that there were potentially, ethical issues associated with the development of neuroscience. And to make a long story short, I kind of lost an opportunity to apply to an interdisciplinary PhD program in philosophy and neuroscience. And I also at the same time had a second interesting option, which was to do bioethics with a focus on neuroscience. And that got me attracted to bioethics. And what attracted me also in bioethics is the idea that we could make a practical difference. That this field was also not only about thinking about big, societal questions, but also a field interested in making contributions in helping people make difficult decisions in healthcare settings. So again, I guess during my PhD, this is a kind of story that repeats itself. I had to reconcile two loves. One of them was this fascination for the human brain and its impact on humanity, and at the same time the desire to pursue a form of bioethics that would have practical implications. And I started with the first kind of orientation, and I realized it was so early on that there was no literature on what came to be called neuroethics a few years after. So I kind of left that aside, did some independent work in the area, and then got interested in doing empirical research on clinical ethics, so difficult ethical questions raised in the healthcare settings. And I did basically kind of a tour of Quebec healthcare institutions to study how difficult cases were being dealt with.
Could you talk to me about some of these difficult cases?
Many, as we know actually from the literature, many situations involve decision-making capacity, so patients who decline certain interventions, and then their decision-making capacities are called into question by the hospital staff, physicians, and nurses. So that's not the only situation they deal with. Obviously, they deal with a whole range of situations, but in practice, a lot of it is about these difficult questions related to consent and decision-making. I think we need to expand that, and we'll probably talk about this together. So I realized also that these clinical ethics committees had a kind of a narrower focus than I expected. they tended to be called upon for a bit like firefighters to put down the fire, but they didn't really do so much proactive, preventive ethics work, to tool people in addressing issues before they became like large fires, so to speak. So anyhow, closing that parentheses, I had a chance after doing this doctoral work to do a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University focused on the new field of neuroethics, which now was just burgeoning. And given my prior interests, I was able to participate very early on in the development of this field in the US. And then when I was recruited in Montreal at the Montreal Clinical Research Institute, I was privileged to be in a position to start the first Canadian group dedicated to neuroethics. So I guess that's a long story to explain my academic evolution. And I think just to say this quickly, I think from a kind of a personal, the personal side of things, I came from a family that had very modest socioeconomic means. So to me, the idea that we could pursue scholarly work that had a practical impact, that even though it could be very theoretical and high-level thinking, we could still make a positive contribution to people's life. So bioethics really was a good home for someone like me who was kind of put off by very abstract, disconnected ethics and philosophical work, and someone who really wanted to do interdisciplinary and applied work. And actually my PhD was in applied human sciences with a bioethics option. So again, I was very well treated in my interest to go out there in the field, collect data, engage with people. It's an ongoing evolution. I'm still learning a lot from colleagues and the many students I train and people I work with.
Thank you so much for sharing that intriguing trajectory. You're known now for your work in, one might call it pragmatic philosophy, or you've called it living ethics. Could you unpack that for us and tell us what that means exactly?
I think, pragmatism is a very rich tradition. We tend to boil it down to the idea that it's kind of a practical philosophy. But really, it is a philosophy of human development. It is a philosophy of growth, and basically that proposes that human knowledge be, in the service of human flourishing, to put it very briefly. And that's something we've kind of lost track with. But when we look at the pioneers of pragmatism, they were engaged in developing social work, international peace, public education in the US. So basically they were both scholars and social activists, so to speak, involved in all kinds of causes, including minority rights in the 1930s and 40s in the US. So,
and these are figures like John Dewey.
Yeah, exactly. John Dewey. Jane Addams was a famous figure of pragmatism and the first woman in the US to be granted the Nobel Peace Prize. And again, we kind of lose track that these scholars were also recognized for their practical actions to the point where, I think they really participated to what is called in the US the progressive era, where many, many changes were made to kind of mitigate the impact of the very brutal capitalism of the late 19th century.
And this runs counter to what one might call another and perhaps dominant strand within the history of philosophy, at least within the Western tradition, which is this idea that philosophers' jobs involve sort of standing back and kind of trying to discern general principles that can then be applied. Is that kind of the tradition that you're pushing against in this recuperation of philosophical pragmatism?
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of go back again to one of the pioneers, John Dewey, he called that the spectator theory of knowledge. So the idea that scholars are spectators, they're like looking at the world from a view of nowhere, to use a phrase from Tom Nagel. And basically, he proposed instead that we develop like an actor's perspective on knowledge. And that's really why pragmatism is so action-oriented. It's looking at knowledge in terms of its impact and potential to deliver outcomes and be a tool of empowerment. So, as we sometimes attribute Francis Bacon, knowledge is power, but pragmatism says basically, it's power for the people. So they're bringing back kind of knowledge to empower people, promote education, and make things accessible to everyone, basically, so they can participate to a democracy that is not only a regime, but is a way of life. So pragmatism really brought back this perspective of a living philosophy, and that's why we use the term of a living ethics to kind of contrast the kind of work we're doing with the more kind of detached armchair philosophy and ethics that we've seen for many decades, although things have evolved considerably, and I think bioethics is one of the areas in scholarship where we've seen people from the humanities and social science go really practical. And I think it's a really good case example. Some people argue that there's implicit pragmatism within bioethics itself. Some people say that bioethics is implicitly a form of pragmatism. So basically building on that, I think we're trying to push further and bring, again, knowledge to users, stakeholders, so that we can develop a living ethics, a form of ethics that is connected to life experiences and ordinary life experiences in the words and meanings that people make sense of those experiences. And at the same time, propose and empower to have a kind of a learning ethics that adapts and allows people to kind of thrive and grow through sometimes difficult experiences.
So if I'm a participant in one of your experiments and I come to your living ethics lab, what can I expect? What sort of work would we be doing together, and what would I take away from it?
Well, you can expect having a lot of fun, I think. And it's something I like to kind of joke about, because we underestimate the fact we're Homo sapiens. We are, the primates who love to learn, who have a lot of curiosity. And I find that we kind of downplay people's appetite about learning and knowledge. We tend to again have this kind of spectator view that knowledge is in the academia, it's for experts, and at the same time that perspective leaves out a lot of experiential knowledge that people have of their own situations. So to go back to your question, you can expect having fun, because I think learning and making sense of things is rewarding. And that's why we're Homo sapiens. We love to learn. We reward ourselves, by new experiences, traveling, meeting new people. We like doing that. So our research is a bit like an adventure, and often it starts with, coming together and setting the terms of a conversation so we understand each other. So you come to our research, you're a patient, you're a healthcare professional, you feel distress about a certain situation. Let's try to find words to name this. Let's try to understand why this is an issue for you. Let's understand the impact of that situation on you and your family, for example. So that would be step one, basically setting the stage. And then second, we'd probably be in a process where we then after try to really drill down and understand the situation, from multiple perspectives. Because again, if we're all actors, and involved, it means that we also have a perspective. And to understand a human reality, we need to understand those multiple perspectives that make up a situation. Situation is not a third person thing. It's a first person experience of the world. So we need to capture this, through appropriate methods like interviews that allow people to express and explain the meaning of situations they live. And then if this is a problem, then we need a solution. So a third step will be what we call often co-ideation and co-creative methods and participatory methods, or basically the development of situations together. Let's try to co-imagine solutions to this. There's not enough discussion about, let's say, difficult situations. Let's try to see how we can support more discussion. Is it, for example, having a discussion guide? Is it having team meetings? let's pin down ideas to improve the situation. Let's also analyze their feasibility together to see if we have the resources or we need more resources and so on. So the fourth chapter of the adventure will be, let's try it out together. So, let's try this new guide that we've developed together. Let's try this new clinical management strategy we've created together. And then the last chapter is the conclusion, so to speak. Is what have we learned? What can we take away from having done this cycle from, setting a conversation, identifying a problem, thinking about solutions, putting them into action, and then learning from this experience. And probably, it won't have fully resolved the problem, but we'll have made some progress in the direction of better understanding each other and finding practical solutions.
What about for those questions or problems or dilemmas for which there is seemingly no solution? I'm thinking here, for example, of the fact that there's a big conversation in global mental health about the rise of climate anxiety and humanity's, or at least individual humans, seeming powerlessness in the face of ecological collapse. How would you approach that kind of a problem about how to act ethically in the face of the climate emergency from the point of view of living ethics?
Yeah. Well, I'm tempted to quote Winston Churchill, who said, that the pessimist sees basically difficulty in every opportunity, while the optimist sees in every difficulty an opportunity. So, in a sense, maybe pragmatists are optimistic people. They like to think we can make changes. And at the same time, we need to reconcile with the fact that some challenges are really significant and are beyond individual agency, that these are really large problems like climate change. At the same time, I think again, starting to talk about these problems, about what is the situation that we've never experienced as Homo sapiens. We've never faced this situation. We're maybe in an Anthropocene, that we are now changing the geological structure of the world, and this is not something we've kind of grasped with before. It's a new situation, so we don't have maybe the language to describe this. Maybe we don't have ways of wrapping our minds around this problem yet. So let's try to understand the impact of this, and let's also realize that this is probably going to go beyond, only a single person's perspective or experience. It's the totality of the world that is implied by this problem. But again, I think, we will need to start talking about these things. We need to continue talking about this. We need to also be acting out. So I think, the pragmatist kind of inquiry model applies really well to this. Pragmatism is not only about changing the world or the environment, it's also about changing the agent in that environment. And sometimes, we will need to adjust our own thinking and values to our environments. And I think probably, the climate change crisis is going to bring a lot of kind of reworking on our values. It's probably going to bring about a lot of, adaptations in where we find meaning in human experience. Maybe we won't be able to travel so much as we've done, to this point. Maybe we will. We'll find technological means to make this possible. Maybe we'll have to focus a bit more on distributing, opportunities and making the world more equal so that we can, all take away from our experience as human beings, being on this planet more fairly, that we have opportunities for growth and development accessible to all. So maybe our progress won't be in quantity, but it will be in the quality of things we do. And maybe we need to find words to explain to each other what is the value of doing this.
I was going to say, it seems like part of the power of your work, and perhaps in pragmatism more generally, comes from the significance of having language, of having names. I know you've done work with rare diseases, and you know, some of the findings there are that even if somebody's illness can't be treated, the very fact that you have a name for what you're experiencing has a powerfully curative effect. I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, and again, I'm tempted to cite Dewey, who said, language is the tool of tools. And basically the tool from which we create other tools, because it's kind of the mother of meanings. So yeah, I think finding words is really important. And the case example of rare disease is a really good one. It's an area where we're doing participatory work with patients who are affected by rare diseases, and very, very often the most important hurdle in the trajectory of those patients is finding a diagnosis. Their conditions are so rare. Sometimes there are a handful of people on the entire planet who have their conditions. So the diagnostic tools and eventually the treatments are really underdeveloped. So it may take for them 5, 10, 20, 25 years to have a diagnosis. And sometimes they never do have one. And this is a process called the diagnostic odyssey. And it's very, very difficult. And we know from their experiences also that when they do find what they're affected by, that it is salvatory in a sense. I mean, it relieves tremendously. It doesn't necessarily become a treatment, but having the ability to understand what's going on with you, what's wrong, what is the impact, and eventually, that's the power of words, communicating about this, and eventually finding perhaps a community of people who have that shared experience. Now, I know this is not obviously eventually the drug that will cure or alleviate the symptoms of a rare disease, or eventually cure it potentially, but it's a step in this process, and it empowers people to talk about their situation, about their impact, and they're legitimized often by the diagnostic category that they can present as a kind of official label to their conditions. Now, there are problems to the fact that our healthcare system is driven by diagnoses, in a sense, and they are the patients who probably most suffer from this, and point to those weaknesses. But at the same time, they show us the power of words and the power of being able to express the meaning of human experience, and the important role of communities.
It seems like another important aspect of your work involves this process of meaning making, and how it is that we as Homo sapiens, particularly in contexts where religion no longer provides that container or framework to make meaning from experience, how can we make meaning? And it seems like living ethics is very much about grounding that in community and in embeddedness rather than in general principles. I wonder, just as a final question, is there any position you've taken over the course of your career that you've fundamentally changed your mind about, that you've had a kind of 180 degrees about face?
Well, probably there's been an evolution in my work, I think, in trying to, basically, better reflect, the value of human experience. I think we're in a learning trajectory, and as you pointed out, the kind of work we're doing really tries to tap into the idea that ethics is a lever of human flourishing. And in that regard, I think our work connects to very ancient traditions of ethics, actually the origins of ethics, which was mostly focused on living the good life, or eudaimonia. And we're trying to reconnect with this and bring it, to everyone, to make ethics an accessible lever of human development and growth. So, I mean, that perspective, probably does, maybe contradict some of the work we've done that was perhaps a bit more top-down or, directive. But I like to think we've kind of learned from errors we've done, and, and maybe receiving feedback or criticisms about the kinds of things and projects we were doing or their limitations. So I think it's a learning trajectory, and I think that obstacles in a way, as Mandela said, either you win or you learn. So when it's not a success story, I mean, we're learning from difficult challenges we face in the implementation of this kind of participatory ethics.
Eric, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.